So my title for today, Promise of Precision, Theology and the Social Challenges of Precision Medicine. And I'll be taking the term theology with a particular focus on theological ethics. So that's where this is headed. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. And I'll be thinking about the term social in terms of the various kinds of relationship which are bound up with the promissory nature of precision medicine. That precision medicine has lots to do with promises. Again, I'll say more about this as I go on. So at the moment, I'm working on a collaboration with some colleagues from oncology, cystic fibrosis, health economics, behavioural medicine, and medical sociology. And our interest is in improving communication and ethos in precision medicine. And I'll say more about what I mean by those words later. And what this presentation will do is just open up some of the questions we want to investigate together in so doing. So my discipline is Christian theological ethics. We tend to think about organisations or enterprises in light of the quality of the relationships which define them. And so for our research, a key focus is on why relationships in precision medicine are challenging, and in particular, how we should understand this promissory quality of social relationships in precision medicine. And it goes a little bit to what Mike was saying in terms of uncertainty a moment ago. So what do I mean by promissory quality, the promise of precision? So these are some slides from my colleague Tim Morn, who highlights, who's a colorectal cancer oncologist, and he highlights some language from the MRC, £6 million, from the stratified medicine. This is their language will ensure that the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time. That's a kind of promise. The European Alliance for Personalised Medicine has an ambition, which is a kind of a promise, an offer, that the right prevention and treatment for the right patient at the right time will be delivered. Around the Precision Medicine Initiative in the US, which of course Obama was hugely behind, and has analogues, of course, in our country. There is a huge momentum and effort behind this whole area. This is well known. So this is the promise of precision, and as is also well known, imaginative Gleevec, absolutely a crucial breakthrough drug for chronic myeloid leukemia. So there's a narrative of promise, a culture of promise, which is built up around this particular area of medicine, and that's the data there. As you can see, very significant breakthrough in CML. But the reality in cancer since then has been not such good news. Next 71 drugs between 2002 and 2014 by the FDA approved for cancer treatment gave the kind of survival benefits which you see in those graphs there. And so 2 or 3 months, not nothing, but not the kind of breakthrough that people were hoping for. And there's some recent data I heard from the Crick Institute conference the other day, which bears this out to some extent between 2014 and 2018. I haven't got that in this slide. So the reality in cancer has been much more intransigent, and Tim would say if he was here in colorectal cancer, there's been a lot of disappointment as to what's actually happened. Just to put this story up from today and yesterday, not as it were to be pejorative one way or the other, but how Hancock's speech yesterday has been reported is part of a national conversation about promise and expectation in this space. So let me just distinguish a couple of things here in order to get to what I think we can get at ethically. So there are two things going on. There's promises and there's promise. So repeated promises of success may build up a kind of atmosphere, a culture of promise. In such a culture, expectations are heightened that personalised precision medicine will increasingly be delivered. There is, if you like, a narrative of promise that despite many obstacles, the long-forward breakthroughs will eventually arrive. Now, promises in a narrative can be of different kinds. An example which is more clear-cut would be, we will make precision medicine work for everyone. That's a promise. They might be slightly more circumspect. We're confident we'll be able to develop the targeted drugs people need. They might come as a kind of slogan. We will beat cancer sooner. That's a kind of enlisting slogan, I suppose, to join a kind of campaign. So promises can be expressed verbally. They can also be visually mediated. These pictures here, which suggests that all individuals with a specific condition will be stratified in ways which will mean that everyone gets something personalised to them. So however they're mediated verbally or visually, these promises tend to engender what I've talked about as an atmosphere or culture of promise, and with that, expectation and hope. So our question is, what influence do these promises, this culture of promise, have on relationships? Well, it'll depend on which relationships we're considering, how people interact within them, and of course how reliable promises turn out to be, whether promise is fulfilled, whether hope is disappointed, realised, or even exceeded, which is perfectly possible. Now, of course, in light of our limited knowledge, most of us, when we think about it, recognise that our promises always involve some uncertainty. That's the kind of theme that I think Mike was raising in the last presentation. But a culture of promise and a relationship shaped by promise may be more or less alert to this uncertainty as time goes on. In other words, it's possible to become less aware that what is being promised is a promise, and indeed of what is being promised itself. So you lose a sense of attention and focus that there is actually a culture of promise around the activity which you're engaged in. And that happens over time in all sorts of cultural contexts. So that's where this theme of communication comes in. So communication has to do with what's said, represented between at least two parties. It's a broad brushstroke, of course. But think about communication on two levels. These are the ways that we're trying to think about it in our group. The first level, there's communication broadly conceived, that which surrounds government, policy, industry, funding bodies, charities, universities, conferences such as this perhaps. How is the culture of promise which surrounds precision medicine being built up by the communications which each of these entities enlist? And we're calling this communication as rhetoric. Now, there's nothing pejorative here about the term rhetoric. Rhetoric is a perfectly respectable art form in public speech. It's just trying to pick out that communication at this level is often trying to persuade one party of something else. For example, to release funds for X, Y, or Z, to invest in this trial, to pay for this drug, to build this new research institute, or even to fund a project in ethics, looking at the hype and the promise of precision medicine, which is what we're trying to do. So persuasion is a normal part of life, but it's just worth observing that communication as rhetoric is absolutely central to precision medicine. Second level, there are communications conceived in a more focused way at the level of the clinical interaction between doctors or nurses, those being offered or receiving treatment, along with those close to them. So most obviously, let's take cystic fibrosis, one of the areas which we're very interested in. The parents of children who are diagnosed with some form of the condition. This is a key three-way point of interaction, or three or four-way point of interaction going on, a complex act of communication within the consultation environment. So what we're really interested in is what's the interaction between these different levels? How do promises made and a culture of promise which is generated through communication as rhetoric, how does that affect or interplay with the clinical consultation? And then vice versa, is there some feedback between the clinic and the wider culture? So what kind of effects might there be? And that brings us to this next term, ethos. Just check my time, I'm doing okay. So how can we describe what's going on within organisations, in relationships between organisations and in clinical consultations? So what do we mean by the term ethos? Well, by ethos we mean the reasons people have for their words, decisions and actions. The reasons that people have, the reasons that stand behind the kind of enterprises they engage in and the way they explain them, the way they talk about them. And these reasons, the way that these reasons interact with one another, go to constitute the ethos in which precision medicine operates. How is this linked to promise and promises? Well, promises give reasons for some important features of our lives. Most obviously, they give reasons for hope. A familiar example, we trust the promises a spouse or a friend makes that they won't leave us when things are tough. So we ask, why are you hoping for that? And the answer is because someone promised it to me and I trust them. So when we turn to precision medicine, questions might be, what makes you think this drug in development will turn out well? Why do you keep on working on that trial? Just as a sideline, we've done some qualitative work on a particular trial environment, trying to explore what actually keeps people, researchers, going in that. I'm hoping it'll be published next year. But we can expect when we ask these questions to people that they will give more or less reasoned answers to these questions, and these would, we hope, link to evidence of benefit. But also it would probably link to promises made and the culture of promise developed in light of that evidence, and that's what our qualitative research is indicating as to why precision medicine researchers keep on operating as they do. So here's where the different levels matter. At the level of the clinical consultation, we expect care to be taken to avoid over-promising to individuals. We know a good deal more now about the fragmentation of the disease pathway in stratified or precision medicine in light of the work of Sophie Day. Is Sophie still here? I don't know if she's still here. She is still here. So we've certainly argued we've learned a lot from what Sophie's been looking at. It's been interesting to see the kind of 5-year onwards look from your presentation today. So we know a good deal more about fragmentation, but we don't actually know enough about how a culture of promise changes the ethos of consultations and institutions. We don't know what the micro level of interactions look like, and that's what our research project, we hope, will look to investigate, especially in clinical consultations in colorectal, lymphoid and cystic fibrosis. At the level of industry, government and funding bodies and so on, things may be far more complicated. How is care being taken there in terms of language? What reasons are shaping people's words, decisions and actions? Our colleague Alistair Kent from Genetic Alliance UK, who's going to be on our advisory board, summarised it this way. What promises are being made, by whom, to whom, in what terms, underpinned by what assumptions, with what intended consequences. So promises explicitly made can give people reasons for hope, and a culture of promise can then give reasons for hope. So then you put these two together. The way that promises are communicated, of course, matters greatly for the social reality of precision medicine. Promises affect people's lives, what people say, how people think, how they act. And if promises and a culture of promise do give people reasons for saying, thinking or doing X or Y, then they have an essentially ethical quality. Because the reasons people have for word, thought and action will affect how they live, what they do. This will in turn affect the quality of the relationships between clinicians, those being offered treatments, between pharma and governments, between those being offered or receiving treatment and those close to them, family relatives. So in the background, there's a kind of lurking worry here. It's reasonably well established that there's a tendency for promises made in a promissory culture to engender a kind of loyalty to the promise of the technologies. There's a science and technologies studies have done work on this. A loyalty which can, of course, slip over into hype, even exaggeration. And some would say this isn't just a tendency, but a kind of necessity built into the biomedical research enterprise. Perhaps it's just what it is perhaps it's just part of what it is to be hopeful about the future. So what to say into this space? And this brings me to the final theme I want to introduce today, and that's a theme about covenants. I've chosen the term covenant. Mike's thinking about contracts. These are related terms, not quite the same perhaps, and we could talk about the difference possibly. So I talked about promise and promises. I want to finish with this term covenant, and it seems very relevant to the kind of social challenges and opportunity which precision medicine presents. So an atmosphere of promise doesn't imply any particular obligations. In fact, loyalty to a promissory culture may weaken people's commitments to certain kinds of obligations which they've undertaken. Obligations to be candid, for example, or to report research results accurately and fully. But explicit or even implicit promises do create obligations which should be honoured. A covenant names a promissory relationship in which those obligations take a definite shape over time. So a covenant speaks of at least two things. First, obligations on at least two parties to a covenant. And second, a shared journey, where parties to the covenant accompany one another over time. So covenant is essentially temporal notion, certainly in my tradition in theological ethics. First then, obligations. A long-standing focus for covenantal thinking in medicine, the quality of relationships between clinicians, those receiving treatment. And this covenant requires not precision medicines, plural, but rather precision or accuracy in talking about medicines. In short, covenant depends on an obligation of candour. So a covenant has an inherently moral quality to it, comes with obligations which are explicit. The second, a shared journey. People who are in covenants journey through time together, and that's a vital social reality. Colleagues in lymphoma report this all the time, the way that a patient will journey with a clinic over quite a long period of time, and how the clinical part of that patient's journey is, I suppose, understood in terms of the larger arc of their lives. So most obviously we see this in covenants again like marriage. We might see it also in treaty relationships. And I'm going to go back to the B word again, such as those which bind nation states together. The Maastricht Treaty, for example, is a kind of covenantal relationship. We also see it in this context in the way that clinicians and charities journey with those being offered or receiving treatment and those close to them. So we're working with 3 charities, so I'll mention those in a moment. So here's the question which I'll finish with. For those being offered or receiving treatment, the promises and culture promise around precision medicine seems likely to have some kind of impact on the personal journeys through life which people make. Those journeys typically involve ways in which people have vested their hopes for life, what's important to them. So what impact will the promise of precision at a cultural level, rhetorical level, and in the clinical environment have on people's personal journeys? What influence is it having? What influence indeed should it have? The question which follows is, bearing in mind the promissory culture of precision medicine, whether at the level of rhetoric or of consultation, how can we at least work that clinicians and others should first do no harm, and of course more positively engage deeply in the narratives, the journeys, the values of the patients who are under their care. So that the reasons for hope which accompany the promise of precision should not subvert or replace or distract from people's hopes and loves, the core identity that people have in their most important relationships. That's the core concern, that the promise of precision doesn't overlay or displace or distort those more basic features of people's lives. Of course, they will interact in various intricate ways which we're looking to investigate. The communication of the promise of precision honours the underlying covenants which shape people's lives at critical moments in their lives, with their families, friends, but also with their clinicians, nurses, doctors, and so on. So the peril of the promise of precision is that people's personal journeys become somehow negatively affected by the narrative which surrounds precision medicine. That a personal journey becomes colonised or taken over by this promissory narrative. And this is not the social reality anyone wants, but it's something which a culture of promise, embedded in societal expectations and clinical culture, can lead to. And certainly the patient organisations who are working with are concerned about this and have voiced this as something which they would like to see looked into. So the hope for the promise of precision medicine is that it will so realise its promise as to enable people to flourish within those covenantal forms of life we all hope to enjoy. Friendship, family, work, community, religion, for example. And the thought here is that covenantal relationships, especially those which take form in the clinic, should operate to avert that peril and be compassionate and candid about that hope. But the implication is that we all had a part to play in how communication happens and what impact this has on the ethos of precision medicine. The last thought now, engaging with how the promise of precision shapes culture and with what consequences for our lives is a social challenge, and it requires the kind of collaboration which, the collaborative approach which Mike referenced. So that's what we're hoping to look into. We had some qualitative data behind us already, but we are encouraged now to go on and find out more, and these are the collaborators with whom we're working. Thank you for your attention.